Raising a Socially Successful Child by Dr. Stephen Nowicki. Chapter 8, Body Language. The traffic cop at the intersection. I confess that, thanks in large part to my parents, I'm very good at both sending and receiving information via body language. My mother, who was Italian, never felt an emotion that she did not express immediately with her hands, arms, shoulders, and general posture. If foods weren't cooked to her satisfaction, for example, she would first wipe her hands on her apron and then raise them toward the ceiling, shaking them in frustration. My father was another case entirely. He was a large man who came from a Polish family where little emotion was expressed in general, and in gestures specifically. As a child, I had to learn to watch him carefully in order to read the minute gestural indications of his mood. A raised eyebrow, shoulders a bit slumped, hands tight were the subtle signs indicating he was upset. My experiences with these distinct and opposite styles equipped me with relationship skills that served me well not only as a child, but as an adolescent and adult. Thanks to my father, I became adept at noticing and interpreting body language cues that weren't always discernible to other children. Some of my elementary and high school teachers were not very expressive in their gestures, but focusing on their subtler movements clued me into what they were trying to communicate, which in turn helped me to learn better in the classroom. At the same time, my mother's dramatic body language taught me the importance of being gesturally expressive. Although I am grateful to my father, any time I am in a psychotherapy session with a taciturn client who doesn't say much verbally, but reveals a lot through the way he's tightly holding his body or fidgeting with his fingers, my mother gets special thanks when I'm teaching in a large lecture class and need to connect with hundreds of students, even those in the back rows. I'm not always aware of how much I use body language as I walk about the lecture hall, with my arms and hands in constant motion. But afterward, when I find my arms and shoulders are sore, I know that I've been channeling my Italian mother. In this chapter, we'll consider the human body as a marvelous instrument of social communication. The way we sit, stand, move our hands, place our arms, nod, lean our bodies, walk, and otherwise move carries all kinds of emotional information about us. And in turn, the body language of others allows us to infer all kinds of emotional information about them. Often, gestures and posture will be accompanied by other forms of nonverbal communication that enhance our understanding of those effective messages. For example, when someone smiles, this may convey cheerfulness, but if they nod their head vigorously while doing so, it's more likely to convey joy. Conversely, when a smiling person has a stiff, rigid posture with their body turned away, this is going to convey something different and likely more complicated than simple happiness. Body language is not simple for children to learn. For one thing, the number of possible gestures available for use is vast. Think of the simple yet vital gesture for stop, a hand held in front of us with the palm facing outward. This universal gesture can mean different things, from maybe back up a bit to don't come anywhere near me, and everything in between, depending on the angle of the hand and the speed at which it's thrust outward. In fact, psychologist Maurice Kraut has identified more than 5,000 different meaningful hand positions. And anthropologist Gordon Hughes has isolated more than 1,000 body postures in total. Although the majority involve our hands and torsos, any part of the body has the capacity to communicate an effective message. Psychologists who study nonverbal communication tend to classify gestures and postures in one of four categories: emblems, illustrators, regulators, and effectives. Emblems refer to gestures, most often with the hands, that have verbal equivalents, such as the gesture for stop. Other examples are Churchill's famous V for victory, a wave goodbye, putting your hand to your ear to signify an inability to hear someone, or a thumbs up to mean okay. Illustrators, on the other hand, don't convey a distinct message, but they help make what a speaker is trying to communicate clearer. For example, an emphatic movement of hands suggests that the sender is excited to be making an important point, or in my mother's case, any point at all. Whereas clenched fists are a sign that a person is angry, frustrated, or feeling defensive. While illustrators most often involve the hands, the torso, or even the entire body may get involved as well. Like in the case of someone bouncing up and down and punching the air while telling you he's just gotten some fantastic news. Regulators moderate the turn-taking crucial to any successful social interaction, and include nodding, leaning forward or back, and hand gestures angled toward another person, signaling an invitation to speak. Effectives, the fourth and final type of gesture, are the emotional equivalent of emblems and carry a distinct emotional message, such as shaking a fist to show anger, shrugging shoulders to convey confusion, or putting our head in our hands to communicate sadness. In order to understand the power of gestures in our lives, you only have to picture a traffic cop standing at a busy intersection, cars coming and going in all directions, and consider how just one person wearing the correct kind of uniform is able to control the movement and direction of multiple cars and pedestrians and direct the flow of traffic using only her posture, arms, and hands. In our everyday lives, gestures and postures operate more subtly, usually outside of our awareness. Yet, like the traffic cop, they direct and control the flow of our interactions. And without them, our attempts to engage in the give and take of meaningful interaction can end up instead resembling the gridlock and confusion of a busy intersection in which traffic lights are broken. Why body language matters. Body language stands apart from other forms of nonverbal communication in a number of other important ways. For one, it's the most difficult to fake. Even accomplished stage and screen actors will struggle to adapt their body language to different roles. That's because gesture and posture are almost as innate to us as our DNA, and are simply not as easy to control as facial and vocal expression. Another distinction of this particular nonverbal channel is that it's difficult, if not impossible, to turn off. Ever stand on the opposite side of the room and watch people having a conversation? Their bodies are constantly moving. Most people can't even sit still when talking on their phone. Their hands and arms, and sometimes their legs and head position, change constantly, as though the person they were talking to was right in front of them. Whether we're conscious of it or not, every movement we make sends out social and emotional information, even when we're sitting still. We're saying something through our posture. Further, our brains process social and emotional information coming from body language faster than with any other nonverbal channel. In one fascinating study, when Hanneke Mieren and his colleagues at Tilburg University in Holland showed participants photos in which the emotion on the person's face contradicted the emotion expressed through body language, such as a smiling person standing with a dejected posture. Both the verbal report of the participants and the measures of their electrical brain activity clearly showed that when the two nonverbal channels sent conflicting messages, the emotion communicated by the body won out over the facial expression. The researchers concluded that this was because the brain receives and processes social, emotional information from the body faster than it does information received from the face. What this tells us is that being skilled at reading gestures can give us a distinct advantage in assessing how others are feeling. If, for example, someone is greeting you with her shoulders raised toward her ears and clenched fists at her sides, you might correctly infer she's in a rage, even if she's grinning and telling you verbally that she's excited to see you. The way we walk also communicates information about how we feel. When we step into a room with our shoulders back and head held high, this immediately projects a sense of confidence and poise to those around us. And when we project confidence, others view us more positively. Conversely, when we walk into a room with our shoulders slumped, our neck curved forward, and our chin and eyes cast down, those around us may well assume we're not having the best of days, or worse, that we don't want to be there. Despite the advantage that correctly interpreting body language offers us, we tend to spend a surprising amount of time paying attention to what faces and voices are communicating. Psychologists Marianne Goldberg and Kenneth Holmquist found that during our interactions, we spend more than 90% of the time looking at others' faces, leaving only a small percentage of our attention for other sources of nonverbal information from the rest of the body. Yet there are many instances in which we are forced to rely on body language because the other nonverbal channels are blocked or compromised. When someone is standing at a distance from us, for example, we must use gestures and posture to evaluate her affective state. We can't see her facial expression or hear her tone of voice. As adults, we do this instinctively at social events when deciding whether or not to approach someone. If his or her body language is open and friendly, we approach and introduce ourselves. But if the body language tells us that the person is closed off or in a bad mood, we may steer clear. During the pandemic, when most schools imposed strict social distancing rules, gestures and postures were often children's major source of emotional information. With students spaced at least 6 feet apart from one another, making it even more difficult to read the faces and voices that were already masked, distorted by screens, or otherwise compromised, body language became the most dependable way to communicate nonverbally for teachers and students alike. Gestures, gait, and posture. The ability to adapt our body language to different situations plays a major role in our social success throughout our lives. I can still picture Ricardo, a 9-year-old child at an elementary school where I was observing various classes, whose use of expressive gestures helped make him a popular leader. When it came time to pick a captain of the school soccer team, Ricardo was the obvious choice. If the team was doing well, he would run around them with infectious enthusiasm, cheering and waving his arms, giving thumbs-up signs to the spectators, slapping the other players on the back, or high-fiving them. When the team was losing, he could lift everyone's spirits with an exaggerated shrug that seemed to say, "You did your best," or arms raised above his head in a "come on" gesture to get everyone pumped up again. Despite his skill as a player, I doubt Ricardo would have been picked for this leadership role if he hadn't been equally skilled at using this nonverbal vocabulary to unite and inspire his team. Research also shows that people who use hand gestures with fluency and frequency are more compelling and engaging in their communication and connect more easily with others. In Amy Cuddy's popular 2012 talk, TED Talk, "Your body language may shape who you are," the social psychologist asserts that 2 minutes of power posing to loosen you up before a job interview can increase your chances of impressing the viewer and getting hired, the interviewer. And speaking of TED Talks, a recent evaluation of TED presenters by author Vanessa Van Edwards revealed that the most popular TED Talkers used close to twice as many hand gestures during their talks as the least popular one. The type of gestures one used also had a big impact. Popular presenters were more likely to use 7 specific kinds of gestures, including one in which hands are held about 18 inches apart, as though the speaker were trying to demonstrate the size of some invisible object known as measure the loaf, and one where the thumb, rather than the forefinger, which is associated with scolding, is raised to emphasize an important point, known as the fist point. Alan Pease of Macquarie University, one of the highest rated and most viewed TED Talk speakers, suggests one of the possible reasons hand gestures can make such an impact is that there are more brain connections to the human hand than to any other area of the human body. Perhaps the take-home message for children who are forever fidgeting is not necessarily that they fidget less, but that they learn to use their tendencies toward expressive hand gestures to their advantage. Our posture and gait can also have a very real impact on how we are perceived. For example, people whose arms, legs, and torsos are engaged in fluid motion when they walk are generally perceived as more confident than those who walk haltingly or stiffly. In fact, research by psychologists Brittany Blazkowicz and Craig Bennell discovered that people whose strides were longer or shorter than typical, who tended to shift their weight when they walked, who only activated a part of the body or tended to move only one side of the body at a time, and who lifted their feet slightly higher than typical, were more likely to fall victim to bullying or even assault. Blazkowicz and Bennell also pointed out that individuals who are prone to engage in bullying seemed to be especially adept at recognizing these cues of vulnerability in the walking styles of others. The good news is that how we walk and present ourselves is learned. The child who is carrying himself in ways that invite bullying, for example, can be taught to stand up taller and prouder as a way to avoid being targeted as a victim. If you didn't grow up in or near an urban area, you may remember receiving this advice when visiting a big city for the first time. To avoid becoming a target for crime, walk rapidly, keeping your eyes down, and avoid eye contact. A friend's teenage daughter was given this very advice before going to New York City for a summer internship. She followed it and stayed safe throughout her trip. This is just one of many ways we can educate our children about how to use body language to their advantage. Even though mastery of this particular nonverbal channel can have major social and academic benefits, most parents, educators, and caregivers don't spend much time thinking about the ways we use our bodies to communicate. Although some adults might know something about power posing at work, few are well versed in the importance of body language at home and in the classroom. And while parents who use more expressive body language tend to have children who use more expressive body language, as was the case with my mother and me, most parents don't give children very much guidance in this area. For this nonverbal channel in particular, awareness can go a long way. Again, there's a classic Seinfeld episode to illustrate my point. The wink begins with Jerry eating breakfast with Elaine and George at a restaurant. As Jerry digs into his grapefruit, he accidentally squirts juice into George's eye, causing him to blink with irritation. After breakfast, George goes to work, but unbeknownst to him, his eye is still blinking occasionally. Later that morning, while George is at his desk, the president of the company comes by to ask George how he's getting along with his new supervisor. George assures the president that everything is just fine, adding that he enjoys working with the supervisor. Then he blinks. The president, who of course knows nothing of the earlier grapefruit incident, interprets this involuntary gesture as a wink, meaning the opposite of what he is saying with his words, and asks George if George is having a problem with him, to which George says he's doing a great job and blinks again. To which the president says, "I understand." Those unintentional blinks negated George's words and twisted the entire meaning of what George was trying to convey. This happens several times throughout the rest of the episode. And by the end of the day, everyone who has interacted with George is upset with him, but he doesn't know why. Like George, children who don't understand how to read or express body language may not realize why they're alienating others, especially if no one will fill them in about their mistakes. Imagine a child who constantly wrings his hands without realizing that the other children interpret this as anger, when really that child is just feeling nervous. Without an adult to step in and correct his mistake, he may continue to struggle socially for no good reason. As with all the other nonverbal channels, it's important to recognize the role played by cultural differences. As Desmond Morris, an internationally recognized expert on gestures, points out, many gestures are culturally specific, and so we must be particularly careful when using them in cultures different from our own. Some positive gestures in our American culture, like the popular OK sign, thumbs up, and V for victory or peace, are obscene ones elsewhere. Roger Axtell, author of Essential Do's and Don'ts, Essential Do's and Taboos, has written extensively about the mistakes American business travelers can make by assuming their gestures mean the same thing all over the world. One particularly embarrassing example is that of George W. Bush during the inaugural parade in 2005, when he raised his hand in the Hook'em Horns salute, fist raised upright, index finger and pinky sticking up, to salute the University of Texas marching band as they passed by. When the photo was published worldwide, our president found out he had inadvertently angered or offended those living in Italy, where the gesture means, "Your wife is cheating on you," and in Norway, where people thought he was saluting Satan, and in parts of Africa, where someone convinced he was issuing a curse. This cautionary tale is another reminder of the cultural complexity of nonverbal language. Objectics. Objectics are the clothes, accessories, scents, and other items that we put on our bodies to convey information about who we are. While not body language per se, they are in many ways an extension of our bodies and another nonverbal way of expressing how we feel and what we care about to the outside world. As adults, we make decisions about what to put on our bodies based not only on what we want to communicate about ourselves, but also on the accepted social norms for any given situation or setting. Most people understand that how we dress for a day in the office isn't appropriate for a formal event like a wedding or gala, and that a day at the office will demand a very different outfit from one we might wear to run errands or go to the gym. Similarly, we shower, brush our hair and teeth, and keep our clothing clean in order to present ourselves in a way that is acceptable to others. As adults, we model these norms for our children and help them make appropriate choices while trying to respect their need for self-expression. Despite our own attention to our outward appearance, many parents will tell their children that it's what's inside that truly counts. Such statements are well-meaning, but they ignore the reality for most school-age children who, just like adults, have a set of unwritten rules and norms they must follow in order to be accepted by their peers. And while official dress codes are less prevalent today than when I was growing up, unofficial dress codes still very much exist, and violating them is as alienating for children as it has always been. Young children are surprisingly attuned to what certain clothing says about them and their peers, and it's crucial for parents to understand the role that clothing plays in their lives. Starting as early as preschool, it's a way of making emotional connections and signaling that they belong to a certain group. This can be a fairly complex business, as the landscape is constantly changing. What a certain look says about a child when they are in first grade may mean something very different in second grade. Moreover, kids are constantly moving in and out of new friend groups and trying on new identities, and the clothes that go along with them. As parents, it's important to understand this exploration as a healthy part of growing up. It's also important for adults to understand the degree to which the wrong kind of shirt or cap or insignia or hairstyle can torpedo a child's attempt to connect with others. To a parent, the difference between one t-shirt and another may feel insignificant, but other students are reading finely tuned messages in these choices, messages that adults may fail to understand or notice. I remember one third grader I worked with, Mateo, who was having trouble making friends at school. One day, he came home crying and told his parents that other kids were teasing him about his t-shirts, which often featured flowers, teddy bears, and balloons. His parents thought these shirts were cute, fun, and innocuous, but to the kids in Mateo's class, they seemed babyish. After Mateo's announcement, his parents could have taken the "it's not the clothing that matters, it's what's inside that counts" approach, but they understood Mateo's need to fit in. They let Mateo choose his own t-shirts, and after that, he was much happier at school. And so, yes, you should let your child know that he is valuable and loved no matter what he wears, but you can still give him the tools he needs to make intentional choices. This means helping him understand how to project an image that it's not only age appropriate, but also sends the desired message about who he is and where he sees himself within his larger peer group. Some children may be okay marching to the beat of their own drum and wearing very different clothing from their peers, and that's fine too, if that is your child's intention. But for a child who wants to fit in and is struggling, it's worth being sensitive to your child's need to be accepted by others. There are many ways to guide and support your child when it comes to Objectics. Although you may need to spend time learning about the world he inhabits and the ways that children in that world are dressing, which may be very different from the way you dressed when you were younger. Then take cues from him about what would help him feel at home in it, whether that's a certain type of clothing, sparkly hair accessories, colorful elastic bracelets, or whatever other outward signifiers happen to be in favor. Of course, these things will take on much greater importance once children enter their early teen years. But early elementary school is when they can begin to understand how social information is conveyed through clothing and other objectics. Developing this understanding early forms a strong foundation for the nonverbal skills they will need to express themselves authentically, make friends, and fit in with their peers in adolescence and beyond. Body language in infancy and early childhood. Research shows that body language plays a key role in children's development. During the first few months of life, infants have little control over the muscles necessary for many adult gestures. Although they may thrash their arms and legs around, perhaps in great joy or great annoyance, such flailing doesn't really carry much meaning. However, at around 9 months, they have enough command of their movements that they can begin to use basic gestures such as pointing, which is typically one of the first gestures to appear. But by the end of their first year, they will have learned several additional gestures, including waving, shaking head, putting hands over eyes to play peekaboo, poking, grabbing or pulling, reaching for something they want, showing you something or giving you something, as well as clapping. At this age, these gestures all carry a similar meaning: a request for your attention. These early attempts at communication set the stage for infants' development of verbal and social language, functioning as a first language of sorts. In fact, body language constitutes the nonverbal channel most closely tied to verbal language acquisition, because the area of the brain used for processing gestures is the same area that will be used when words enter the picture. Months before a baby utters the word no, she will be able to vigorously shake her head from side to side to communicate the same language, the same message. Once she's learned the gesture for no, it's then a small step to make the sound na, before firmly closing her mouth as she shakes her head from side to side to let you know that she doesn't want to eat her oatmeal, leaving a trail of mush all over her face and possibly you too. Before you get upset with your child, it's worth remembering that gestural ability at this age has been found to predict verbal language ability some 2 years later, which in turn predicts later academic success. Like most new parents, you've likely marveled at your child's ability to effectively communicate in this way at such a young age. Parents and other caregivers are usually delighted when infants wave hello or blow kisses goodbye. But in truth, these gestures are more than an adorable party trick. By greeting and saying farewell to others, your child is beginning to participate in the give and take necessary for social interactions. Throughout early childhood, your child will use gestures to gain attention and form social bonds. I treasure memories of the way my little grandson would raise his arm straight over his head for me to grasp when taking his first steps, with the sure expectation that I would be there to help him maintain balance. What may seem to have been a simple gesture to prevent himself from falling was an important social transaction. His way of confirming expectations of emotional as well as physical support. In this case, his gesture invited the comfort of touch, as it often does during the first 2 years of life. By 16 months, children will have refined their earlier gestures and added nodding, as well as some culturally specific gestures like high fives, to their repertoire. 16 months is a significant developmental milestone. Research shows that they should have learned at least 16 gestures at this point. See the following sidebar for more on these milestones. Posture also plays a key role in a child's body language at this young age. As Michael Tomasello, an internationally recognized researcher in developmental psychology, has shown, the connection between posture and action is present from as early as 2 years old. Tomasello and his colleagues have used posture as the basic way to measure children's satisfaction with their actions. For example, they found that 2-year-old children showed an elevated posture, the infant equivalent of an adult standing straight and tall, after achieving a goal or helping another achieve a similar goal, even without a reward. In other words, children begin to express their feelings, in this case pride, through their bodies in the same way adults do from toddlerhood on. Gesture milestones in very early childhood. By 12 months, waving. At first, you may not be sure whether your baby is intentionally waving or simply flailing arms, but with time, encouragement, and practice, waving becomes well defined and associated with saying hello and goodbye. Shaking the head. This universal gesture of refusal usually arrives before the affirmative nod for yes. For most children, this is the first gesture that offers them some sense of power and control over their lives. Putting hands over eyes. This gesture, necessary for playing peekaboo, is associated with another developmental milestone known as object permanence. The ability to understand that a person or object hasn't disappeared even when they can't see it. Grabbing or pulling on you. This is an infant's way of getting your attention. Reaching. This gesture can be a way of asking to be given something, usually by wiggling a hand back and forth, to be picked up or to be moved in the direction of a desired person or object. Showing or giving. An infant may attempt to engage you in an interaction of some kind by bringing you a toy or another object. This may be a request to play or a request for help. Either way, showing and giving is the precursor to the more complex ways of initiating a social interaction that your child will learn in the years ahead. Pointing, perhaps the most important of all gestures in early childhood. Pointing is an infant's way of participating in the uniquely human interaction called joint attention. It can also be a crucial component of verbal language development, as when an infant points to an object, then turns to the caregiver to make eye contact, after which the caregiver says the word for the object being pointed at. If an infant is routinely slow to respond or is non-responsive to a caregiver's attempts to direct their attention by pointing toward a person or object, it may be, though is not necessarily, an early indication of developmental delay, sometimes associated with autism. Clapping. This gesture may come as early as 6 months or as late as 9. It's used to indicate general excitement, to entertain, or as an invitation to engage in give and take. Blowing a kiss. One of the most endearing gestures, blowing a kiss, is performed with others to get attention, engage, and express affection. Putting an index finger over the lips. The universal shh gesture indicates the need for quiet, though if and when this gesture emerges depends on whether and how often it is used by the adults in the infant's life. By 16 months, note that these gestures carry a specific meaning rather than reflecting general desires. Nodding. At 16 months, your child should be able to communicate both yes and no using body gestures. Waving a hand up and down in front of the nose. By the age of 16 months, children should be able to use this gesture to indicate stinky. Putting a hand up with the palm facing out. The 16-month-old child should be able to use this gesture to communicate stop or wait. Other symbolic gestures. By 16 months of age, children should be able to use gestures such as thumbs up or shrugging to say, don't know. Tips to help your child with body language in early childhood. Play and interact with your child using gestures. For generations, parents have played simple games with their children such as peekaboo and patty cake. Such joyful actions are, in fact, important business. During the first 18 months of life, children are learning to use gestures and signs to communicate their desires, needs, and preferences by observing the gestures used by those around them. In these earliest stages of childhood, it's a good idea to think of this type of play as providing infants with a vocabulary that will continue to grow in complexity as time goes on. You can take your child's hands and move them together to replicate clapping or waving or blowing kisses. Then show him how to perform these gestures by demonstrating them to yourself. Repetition is crucial. Gestures aren't learned in one try, but rather become absorbed by performing the same movements again and again over many weeks. Introduce turn-taking early on. When you catch your child making a movement such as waving his hands in excitement, you can wave your hands excitedly in response. Copy your child and wait for him to make another movement, then copy that one. By taking turns communicating via gestures, you are teaching him the give and take that is at the core of successful social interactions. Initiate pointing early on, using your voice and smiling face to encourage your child. First, point at something, for example, a cup, then smile and say with a happy face, cup. Repeat this often. Again, learning language, both verbal and nonverbal, takes time and repetition. Carefully select TV shows that will help children learn about gestures. Remember that the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends no screen time for infants under 18 months, except for video chats with relatives. And then after 18 months, limited screen time with parents or caregivers there to supervise. However, after about 18 months, you can find TV shows that will help children to better understand gestures, such as the lovable robot Wall-E and Scrat the Ice Age squirrel, who don't need words to communicate how they feel. Let your child lead through gestures. When you're interacting with your child, wait for him to use invitational gestures such as pointing, showing, or reaching to let you know what he would like to do together. Too often, adults want to direct a child's play, but when you let a child lead, you're allowing him not only to choose, but also to communicate that choice with you. Don't be afraid to use big, exaggerated gestures and movements to engage your child. Think about the way that sports mascots keep children entertained by waving their hands, pointing this way and that, doing little dances. This is how they're able to connect with and keep children's attention, all without saying a single word. Enroll your young child in classes and activities that involve movement and gesture, such as music together classes, described in Chapter 3, dance classes, or martial arts. Taking some kind of movement class will help your child build coordination and other physical skills that are so useful in learning to express themselves nonverbally using their bodies. Body language in late childhood. I'll never forget sitting in an auditorium at a school where I was consulting and overhearing the two first graders next to me as they tried to make sense of a routine being performed up on stage by two visiting mime artists. To me, it was clear that they were miming getting ready for school in the morning, but my two young friends were confused. The first one said, "This is so funny. They're having trouble milking a cow." "No," the other one said loudly, "they're getting their rocket together to blast off to the moon." Listening to their speculation reminded me that without context, young children struggle to identify gestures and their meaning. In late childhood, children need to have access to a whole range of gestural skills. It's during this phase that they will be attempting to engage their peers in relationships independently of their parents, which will require them to identify turn-taking cues and other nonverbal messages conveyed via hands and postures. Think about the negative effect it would have on the beginning of a relationship if the child walked toward another child but didn't understand the meaning of the gesture for stop and continued to invade that child's personal space despite her outstretched hand. Depending on what they have learned at home, school can be a place where weaknesses can be turned into strengths. But too often, children who are having difficulties in this area will have no idea that their body language is the source of their social troubles, and neither will the adults around them. This was the case with Charlotte, an 8-year-old girl I was asked to evaluate who was having more than her share of disagreements with her peers. Observing her in the classroom, I couldn't see anything problematic about her behavior. She paid attention to the teacher and worked diligently on her school assignments. Her teacher told me she was doing well in all her subjects, especially English, and that she was polite and well behaved. However, when I went to observe her during recess on the playground, I saw a quite different Charlotte. At this age, children's body language on the playground tends to split along gender lines. The boys will usually form groups of 3 or more, jostling among themselves and talking to one another while standing side by side. In contrast, the girls tend to pair off, keeping a close but respectful distance from each other, facing each other while talking, and using their hands to express excitement and enthusiasm. But Charlotte stood apart from her classmates with her arms folded tightly across her chest. Based on her posture, she looked less like a child and more like an older woman, an effect that was reinforced when she unfolded her arms to point at other children as though she was scolding them. Needless to say, her body language wasn't going over well with her peers, who were turning their backs on her, shaking their heads, and keeping their distance, all nonverbal indicators of failed connection. Charlotte, it turned out, had a very off-putting resting posture, similar to the resting face. The resting posture is the one we automatically and unconsciously assume when we are in neutral gear. However, just as with resting faces, children's resting posture can communicate a negative emotion even if they aren't actually feeling that way. When children see a fellow student walking around with a lowered head and slouched body, they're likely to assume the child is unfriendly, aloof, or stuck up. Meanwhile, teachers may assume that the child is unhappy or even surly, when that may not be the case. When the source of Charlotte's problems was explained to her parents and teachers, they scheduled times to talk with her to help her become aware of what her body language was saying to others. That's when they learned that Charlotte was often mimicking her favorite aunt, who was a school teacher, and that the two of them often spent time playing school together, hence the very adult-like and sometimes stern-looking posture. After this was discovered, I asked if Charlotte's aunt could be enlisted to explain to Charlotte that although school teachers can stand apart from children and instruct them from a distance, young children are supposed to play and interact with one another. It didn't take long for Charlotte's use of gestures, and in turn her friendships, to improve. Unless corrected, however, young children with negative resting postures may carry this error with them into adulthood. I remember seeing a young man at the request of his manager at a large corporation. The employee in question was bright, polite, pleasant, and motivated, but as I soon discovered, his resting posture involved sitting back in his tilted chair, with his legs spread outward, sometimes with one of them draped over another chair, behavior that was both off-putting to his workmates and smacked of unprofessionalism. Teaching children about the importance of gesture and posture at a young age can help prevent social and professional challenges like this one later in life. Tips for helping your older child with body language. Take time to review basic gestures with your child. By 4 years old, he should be able to understand what gestures are and how they are used to begin an interaction. Review universal gestures with him, such as the shh sign, stop sign, thumbs up, high five. Make sure he understands what these basic gestures mean. It's easy to assume children will have picked this up, but because it's rare for gestures to be taught, your child may well be in the dark. In particular, children may not be aware of the powerful message our hands can deliver. To demonstrate this, you can show him the distinction between the hand movement that communicates stop in a gentle way with hand slightly lowered, and the hand movement that sends a more emphatic stop, hand extended with the palm perpendicular. Then practice these gestures together. Take your child to some noisy place, like a mall, where spoken language can't be heard properly, and have him observe how people are interacting with one another. Ask him to pick out gestures that he sees around him and identify ones he knows and doesn't know. Have him take a guess at what's going on between people based on their gestures by asking, "What do you think those two people are talking about?" You can also ask him what he thinks about a person just from watching their body language from a distance. Ask your child who looks friendly or whom he would like to meet and why. You can even turn it into a game by having your child craft a story about a stranger based on what your child imagines that person is like. Have your child practice standing with different levels of confidence. Talk to your child about posture and standing up straight. And what to do with his hands while standing. Observe whether your child is standing with his hands in his pockets, fidgeting, or flailing. Then ask him to stand like the teacher or various classmates and see if he can differentiate between and imitate these postures. Practice a variety of postures with your child and ask him how he feels when doing each. See if he can communicate the 4 basic emotions: happiness, sadness, anger, and fear, using his body. Ask him to notice how the different postures make him feel on the inside and explain that while he may be sitting that way because he's sad, sitting that way can also make him feel sad, and that a happy, confident posture, on the other hand, can help him feel happier and more confident. Embrace fidgeting. As your child becomes older, your instinct may be to tell him to always sit still, hands folded, bottom on seat, in situations where you want him to pay attention. But research suggests that sitting rigidly in one place creates a greater cognitive load on children, taking energy away from what they should be learning, and that kids should be allowed to fidget and move their bodies, whether to express themselves or to just let off steam. Many schools now allow children to fidget in their chairs, modifying classrooms to include a variety of different areas where students can stand while being instructed, or where they can be more energetic or engage in sensory play. This is why fidget toys are often embraced in classrooms, because they satisfy a child's need to be in motion while still focusing on the lesson. When watching television, mute the sound and see if your child can guess how people are feeling just by focusing on their gestures. Since your child will also be able to see faces, have him try to connect faces with gestures. Do the gestures always correspond to what facial expressions are communicating? Watch sports together. Sports are a gold mine for teaching body language, since players need to be constantly communicating with each other nonverbally, often across long distances, like a baseball diamond or soccer field. American football, for example, is filled with gestures of all kinds, from hand signals indicating a first down to tacklers pumping fists in the air after a good play or clasping hands to forehead after a bad one. Shows like So You Think You Can Dance and Dancing with the Stars are also good sources of gestural learning. Talk to your child about the ways that the performers and athletes are communicating using their bodies. Play charades with your child. This game almost seems to have been invented to teach the use of gestures. You can play basic charades, or you can make it more challenging by asking everyone to wear a mask. Without access to facial expressions, contestants will have to rely on posture, gesture, and body language clues alone. Take your child to age-appropriate theater performances. On stage, actors will often use exaggerated body language to communicate emotions to the audience, making this a great way for children to learn about the meanings behind various gestures. On the way home, talk about how the actors used their bodies to portray their characters. Ask your child if he noticed the way the actors said thank you at the end by bowing, and how the audience communicated their appreciation by clapping or giving a standing ovation. Enroll your child in theater, improv, or mime classes. These will inevitably teach how to use gestures and body language to communicate. Model appropriate self-presentation. Remember that the objectics a child puts on his body are also a form of nonverbal communication. Talk to your child about appropriate ways to dress, depending on the occasion, while modeling appropriate choices yourself. And make sure he understands the importance of basic hygiene and grooming. When your child needs expert intervention. Although most children will modify their gestures and postures once they are made aware of them, some children may take longer to adapt and adjust. Enlisting professionals who focus on movement and dance is very helpful here for longer-term remediation. Registered dance/movement therapists can present a structured program for children to follow. And movement therapists can work with children to better understand what they might be missing in reading others' movements and sending their own. Acting classes can help them learn more about the power of gestures and postures to communicate feelings, not only one-on-one, but to larger audiences. And yoga classes, many studios offer classes specifically for children, may also help your child become more aware of his or her own body in space. The Music Together program for preschoolers and Rhythm Kids for elementary age children may also be helpful, as there are more than a few similarities between the roles of rhythm and gestures in the turn-taking process. In addition, gestures like clapping, pointing, and hand movement play a prominent role in music classes. Next up,